Hello YouTube, Bane666 here. So welcome to part 2 of my takedown of the YouTuber known as Knowing Better, or as I prefer to call him, Scumbag Liar, after the dishonest quote mining he did of Warren Farrell, which I exposed last episode.
There are other factions, some of which are even creepier. Not all MRAs like them being around, but when one of the leaders of the men's rights movement says stuff like this,
if men made the rules to benefit men at the expense of women, here's some of the way the world would look like. We would make rules that every woman would be sexual with us whenever we would like. And that the women who are very young, maybe 13 or 14, would be very interested in us.
It's kind of hard to deny that they are on this list.
If you haven't seen that episode, I highly recommend you watch that before watching this episode. Speaking of last episode, there are a couple of addendums I want to get into before getting back into Knowing Better's video. When my part 1 premiered and I was looking at the chat, I noticed someone mentioned that my home state of Victoria now has quotas for female firefighters. So I thought I'd discuss that a bit, considering Knowing Better insinuated that female firefighters are kept out of firefighting, which accounts for the low number of females.
So instead they go with firefighter, which I find interesting because that profession in particular is one that women have been trying to get into for decades, but have been kept out for reasons. Probably because we all imagine women as these little 90-pound frail objects. But if Zarya wants to be a firefighter, I say let her.
But we're the ones dying, and we die for you guys.
You don't get to say that we're the ones dying and we're doing it for you in jobs you want, but you can't have because they're ours. Women want those dangerous jobs, and as long as they're kept out of them, we as men don't get to complain that we're stuck with them.
Now, obviously, my home state of Victoria doesn't reflect the entire world, but neither does the stats that Knowing Better showed from New York City. However, I do think this is quite interesting and relevant for the topic that he brought up. So this is from an article about 2 years ago called Winds of Gender Diversity Blowing Through the Victorian Fire Services. It says, as the Andrews government moves to restructure the fire services, including by boosting the woefully low portions of women, which sits at less than 4%, attention has turned to the obvious question, is it really a boys' club as some suggest? What are the barriers that appear to be keeping women out? And if the aim is to recruit more female firefighters, another 300 over the next 4 years, how will that ambitious goal be achieved? Some, like Evans, the leading firefighter at Glen Waverley Fire Station, aren't convinced gender targets are even necessary. And we have a quote. If I'm at work and something happens to my house and the fire truck turns up to help my husband and children, I don't care how diverse the people are on the truck, as long as they are the best people on the job, she says. And I agree totally. I really don't care if it's all women or all men, or they're all white or all black, or any combination of all those things, so long as the job is done and the fire burning my house is put out as soon as possible. Now, having said that, I have no issue with diversity in this job or any other, as long as the standards are not lowered. The article continues. It's the kind of view that other female firefighters who spoke to the Sunday Age this week tend to share. The general consensus is that while they're clearly outnumbered by men, the profession operates less like a boys' club and more like a second home. Did you hear that, Knowing Better? Sure, there's banter and some blokiness, but if sexism or discrimination lingers beneath the surface, they personally haven't been victims of it. And while diversity is important, they would fiercely resist any attempts to water down fitness entry benchmarks simply to get more women through the door. Safety is paramount. And I agree 100%. And keep in mind, this is coming from female firefighters. Just let me end my talk on this article with a quote. It's got here, fire brigades tend to judge people on their attitude and their competency. If you tick those boxes, then you're just the same as everyone else. And that's by a female firefighter. So the female firefighters seem to be fairly well accepted. And the Melbourne government, or the Victorian government, I should say, is definitely trying to get more females into that role. And that's a very, very different thing than what was presented by Knowing Better. And I imagine we would see very similar things right across the Western world at the moment. But despite this, I imagine we aren't going to get a 50-50 gender split when it comes to firefighters. I imagine it's still going to be predominantly male. And although they may increase the number of females in the next 4 years, I don't know if they'll reach the 300 or 400 that they're planning to. But if they do, I have no problem with that as long as they're capable of doing the job. Now, I don't think the requirements should be raised to keep women out, but I definitely don't think they should be lowered to allow women who can't meet the requirements in. But as long as they can meet the existing requirements, I have no issue with it. The other thing I want to quickly talk about before going back to Knowing Better's video is the topic of whataboutism, which is something overly used these days. The stereotype involving men's rights activists and whataboutism that we commonly hear from feminists is that there are a group of women somewhere on the internet discussing a women's issue, and suddenly the evil men come in and disrupt the conversation. Of course, these men are always MRAs, and they disrupt the conversation by saying, "What about the men's?"
It happens to men too, you know.
It happens to men.
Do you want a point? It happens to men as well. Oh, yeah, okay.
And suddenly the entire conversation falls apart. And the feminists conclude that these men, or should I say MRAs, because they're always MRAs, apparently. But apparently these men don't really care about men's issues, and they're just saying these things because they want to hurt women. They want to shut down women's discussions about women's issues. And they're just using the men's issues as an excuse. Now, I hear this all the time from feminists.
What about the men's?
And it's incredibly ironic. I'll get to the reasons why in a little while. But this is clearly not whataboutism, and it's easy to debunk. You see, feminists commonly claim that we don't need a men's rights movement because feminism is there for everyone. Feminism is just equality. Feminism cares about everyone's issues, regardless of gender.
2 of my friends committed suicide, and I want the peace of understanding why that happened.
Wow. When did this happen?
It happened about 2 years ago. It was one after the other like that.
Did you expect to get some addressing of suicide issue at the talk here?
Yes, I did.
What I have to ask on that, and I'll ask you, is why this space to talk about that? Like feminism, for example, offers lots of spaces to talk about mental health issues, talk about depression, both in men, women, and people who don't identify within the binary.
Okay, if that's the case, and you have feminists who are constantly talking about female issues and not talking about men's issues, then it is perfectly reasonable for men to say, what about the men's issues? Okay, if you're claiming you represent everyone, in theory, but in practice you only represent some people, then it's perfectly reasonable for those other people to say, why aren't you talking about our issues? Now, Knowing Better did use a metaphor about potholes.
Oh, you want to fill that pothole? Well, what about fixing the sidewalks on my street? Oh, so you care about
terrible tragedy.
Well, I didn't see you complaining during
other unrelated terrible tragedy.
So let me give you a metaphor about potholes, which I think sums up what I just said. Imagine there's a town somewhere, and this town is divided in half by a train track. So we have the east side of town and we have the west side of town. Now the council workers always fix the holes on the east side of town. Whenever there's a crack in the road, they immediately fix it. Whenever there's a pothole, they immediately fix it. And the roads are near perfect. But on the west side of town, yeah, it's a different story. The holes are never fixed, the roads are left to decay and fall apart, and it's not great driving on those roads. Now, under those circumstances, do you think the people on the west side of town saying, what about our roads, what about these potholes, do you think that's a reasonable thing to say? Because after all, the council workers should be fixing all the potholes, right? They should be representing everyone. They should be working for everyone. And if they're only doing half the town, and ignoring the other half, then asking why aren't they doing the neglected half is a perfectly reasonable question. Now, I expect Knowing Better won't understand any of that, so let me put it in terms that maybe a social justice warrior will understand. Imagine exactly the same scenario, right? But the east side of town is predominantly white, and the west side of town is predominantly black. Now do you get it? Right? Do you think the black citizens of the west side of town saying, why the fuck are you ignoring our side of town? Right? Do you think that's a legitimate concern? Or would you call that whataboutism? I'm guessing you wouldn't. I'm guessing you would say they have a fucking right to complain, right? Because their needs are being neglected based on nothing but their race. Now, for some reason, when we swap out race with gender, suddenly they can't understand it anymore. Suddenly it's over their head, right? They just don't get the concept. How strange. So I guess feminists have two options here. They can either stop claiming that feminism represents equality for everyone and just admit that it's just about women and just about women's issues. Yeah, which is fine, right? I've got no problem with them doing that. But just be fucking honest about it. And if that's the case, if, men or MRAs are bringing up what about as a derailing tactic, supposedly, then you might have an argument. Now, there's a couple of other reasons why you technically don't, but, you have a better argument because you're focused solely on one group. And because you're focused solely on one group, you shouldn't have to deal with issues concerning other groups, right? But as long as you claim that you represent everyone, no matter their gender, and it's just equality for everyone, your whataboutism argument doesn't hold water. Now, the other reasons why it's bullshit is because women's issues get far more attention than men's. Knowing Better actually brings this up later on, so I'm not saying anything too controversial. He actually agrees with this point. It comes up when he's talking about breast cancer versus prostate cancer. But if women's issues are getting all the attention and all the funding, then surely saying, what about the men, is a perfectly reasonable response. Because if men don't say, what about the men, then nothing's going to get done, is it? If men's issues are being ignored and underfunded and aren't getting any attention or publicity, that's not going to change unless people speak up. That's not going to change unless people say, what about the men? And that's not a derailing tactic. That's trying to get attention to real issues that need to be dealt with. Now, there is one more reason why the whataboutism argument is sheer bullshit when used by feminists, and that's because they're massive hypocrites. Sure, occasionally there may be some men who say, what about the men, to some feminists online when the feminists are talking about a female issue. But we constantly get the same thing. When we're talking about male circumcision, we get, but female circumcision is worse, so that's all that we should focus on. Instead of focusing on both and saying that, all newborns should have genital integrity, apparently we can only focus on female circumcision. And bringing up male circumcision means you hate women or something. It's a strange argument. Every time we bring up male suicide, we get more women attempt suicide, which, as I've pointed out in the past, is a false statistic. But anyway, we constantly get these what about the women's arguments. Not only that, when we try to hold talks about male suicide, we get protests. We get people shutting them down. We get people pulling fire alarms. So you don't get to make the argument that the nasty MRAs are shutting down women's conversations about women's issues by saying, what about the men, when you guys physically turn up and do that. Do you not understand what you're doing is worse? And for the record, I've never, ever heard of men's rights activists turning up and shutting down a women's event. I've never heard them turning up and physically shutting down a talk on female suicide or anything like that. To my knowledge, it has never happened. The opposite, though, when feminists turn up at our events, yeah, that's really fucking common, isn't it? So if you want to talk about shutting down conversations and derailing them, well, maybe try not being massive hypocrites, okay? Now, two other quick points before I get back to Knowing Better's video. A number of people have pointed out that he claimed that the red pill was made by men's rights activists, and I missed that. Well, I heard it, but I didn't say anything because I thought it was nitpicking, but I guess it is a valid point to bring up, considering the number of articles that claim that it was funded by MRAs and is therefore MRA propaganda, which is untrue, by the way.
To say I'm for gender equality, I'm for women's rights and men's rights now, and I'm not a men's rights activist, and the film was not funded by MRAs. That is a lie that's being perpetuated by Australian media. TheRedPillMovie.com.
But yes, it was made by a feminist at the time. By the end of it, she was no longer a feminist. That is true. But she's also not an MRA. Okay, so it is not a movie made by MRAs. And one other thing I should have pointed out last episode, and that is Paul Elam is a former truck driver. So Knowing Better's whole argument about MRAs not really caring about truck drivers because it's not heroic, which I proved was sheer bullshit, by the way. I forgot to mention that Paul Elam, for a time, drove a truck. So, yeah. Anyway, let's get back into Knowing Better's video. He's now going to talk about conscription and the military.
Take the military, for example. Women have always been in the US military in a support role. Nurses, administration, that sort of stuff. But they've been begging to be in combat for decades.
Okay, so I guess the first question is, how many women are begging to be in frontline combat roles? Well, I did find one survey which suggested that about 8%. That's 1 in 12 women in the military would like to be on the front lines in some capacity.
The Secretary of Defense finally opened up combat roles to women in 2013, and they started filling them in 2016, much to the chagrin of male politicians.
Yes, male politicians who see male lives as disposable, but at the same time see female lives as needing to be protected. Yeah, so, this is interesting because every time we bring up a male issue, we hear, but we live in a world where the majority of leaders are male. Yeah, but they tend to pander to women or look after women or protect women. And sometimes that backfires for the feminists because most feminists want women to be able to have the choice of being on the front lines. And that's not going to happen if the male politicians are protecting them and seeing males as disposable. But it most definitely works in the favour of feminists in other cases, like domestic violence, for example, where protecting women is most definitely a priority. But in both cases it comes from the same core of protecting women, or should I say prioritising female safety. And I should point out that this isn't a male versus female issue as much as it's kind of being phrased that way by Knowing Better here. Let me relate a personal story. And I'm guessing some of you might be able to relate to some of it. So back in 2011, I was dating a particular young woman, and we'd been out all day, and we were just getting back to her place in her car, and the topic of females on the front line came up. And I said to her, as long as they meet the requirements and they want to do it, I have no issue with it. Now, if looks could kill, you wouldn't be seeing this video right now. I imagine many of the men out there have been in similar situations where they've received a look like that. Just in case you're unfamiliar with that particular look, let me describe it to you. It's the type of look that a normal person would give someone if they said that they thought it was perfectly fine for adults to fuck children. Yeah, it's not a good look. So why exactly did I get this look? Well, because I suggested that women's lives should be risked. But, only those who want to, right? But that doesn't matter. I suggested that women's lives should be put at risk, and some women might get injured or killed. And what kind of person am I for suggesting that? Clearly, I must be a misogynist. I mean, what other possible explanation could there be? And I could tell by this look on her face that she is wondering if she really knew me, if I was really the person that she thought I was, for merely suggesting that men and women should be treated equal in this case. Because you see, it never crossed her mind that at the moment there are men on the front lines risking their lives, being injured and dying. That was never a consideration. Not, at least not in the same way that females on the front line is. Because in her mind, they were invisible, or that was just what men do. That's their role, that's their duty. It's not really that big a deal if they get killed or injured, because, you know, it's just men. But daring to suggest that women who want to should have that same opportunity, obviously I'm a monster. What other explanation could there be? Now, obviously I'm not suggesting all women think this way, but some do, just as some men do, and that's really the point why I'm bringing up this story. It's not a male versus female thing. There are some men and women who are for it, and there are some men and women who are against it. And it's not even a left and right thing, because once again there are people on both sides who agree and disagree with it. Although, to be fair, the extreme right tends to be more protective of women when it comes to combat. But, you know, there are feminists who think this way as well, without a doubt. So there are a couple of arguments as to why women should not be on the front line. The most common one is that it will reduce the fighting effectiveness of the troops, right? Now, this is actually true if you lower the standard to get women in. And let me be clear, I'm dead against that in every possible way. If women are capable of meeting the standards which are presently there, then I have no problem with them going on the front line. But the problem is when we start to water down those standards to meet quotas to get more women in. This is exactly the same thing as with the fire brigade. Another reason I've heard as to why women shouldn't be on the front line is that male soldiers will treat them differently. Now, how they treat them differently really depends on who you ask. If you ask some people, the male soldiers will be more protective of the females and therefore might compromise the fighting effectiveness of the unit or possibly put the male soldiers at more of a risk. Although other people believe that the men, always being monsters, will just treat the women badly because that's what men do to women, apparently. So I say, why not have a compromise between those who want women on the front line and those who don't? Once again, let me stress, keep the present standards, and then when women meet those standards and are capable of passing those tests, we put them in an all-female unit and we give them a fair go, and either they succeed, right? Either they're just as effective as the male fighting units, or possibly even more so, or alternatively, they fail, in which case we can reassess the situation. And of course, this would remove a lot of the opportunity for those evil men to, be sexist towards the women's, which is one thing we always hear. And for those who complain that a female soldier wouldn't be able to drag a wounded male soldier to safety, well, she's more likely to be able to drag a female soldier to safety, right? So that would be my suggestion. Now, if anyone's got a reason why they think that wouldn't work, I'm more than happy to listen to it. I've never been in the military, so quite possibly there's something I've overlooked.
So whenever you're shown these statistics, keep in mind that women weren't allowed in combat during any of these conflicts, despite wanting to be.
Okay, so here's the argument we hear over and over again whenever we bring up how unfair the draft is, and that is that women weren't allowed in combat. In fact, I think Big Joel brought up the exact same point. So it's not surprising that Knowing Better also brought it up, because I know for a fact that he's watched Big Joel's response videos to the Red Pill. In fact, Knowing Better links to them in his description. But it's a bullshit argument, because it's comparing women being prevented from doing something, which, like I've said, I acknowledge is wrong. But it's comparing women being prevented from doing something compared to men being forced to do something. And I have to ask the question, which has the more dire consequences? Now, it's a pretty simple question to answer, because obviously those men forced to go off and fight in many cases have come home broken, either physically or mentally. And that's the ones who actually made it home, as opposed to the ones who died. Now, personally, I would say that is far worse than being prevented from going off and potentially getting killed or physically or mentally broken. So it's not really a fair comparison. Yes, it is true. It was unfair that women were prevented from being in the military. I agree. But it's really not on the same level as forcing men into combat. And I have to say, this is just a derailing tactic used by feminists constantly.
Whenever we talk about the military in the scope of men's rights, we inevitably end up talking about the draft, officially known as the selective service system. Every male in the United States is required to register for selective service between the ages of 18 and 25. Failing to do so is a federal crime that will haunt you forever.
Okay, so let's get this straight. There is a requirement placed on males which is not placed on females, and not signing up to this requirement is going to have dire consequences, right? Well, I assume that he's going to agree that it should apply equally to men and women then, right? Because he's just after equality, isn't he? Isn't that the line that he's given us? And, you know, feminism cares about men too, so I assume that he wants the exact same standards for men and women, and he's not going to be making any arguments which is going to dismiss MRAs talking about the draft. Nah, of course he's not going to do that, because he's not really interested in equality, is he?
Luckily, you may have done so without remembering. I filled out a card at the post office. I remember it being a big deal, but you might have done it by just checking a box on your FAFSA, the form you fill out when requesting financial aid for college. Or if you have a driver's license in any of the yellow states, you were automatically registered. The draft is somewhat of a non-argument for several reasons. The most obvious is that it really hasn't affected you. Failing to do so is a federal crime that will haunt you forever. Will haunt you forever. You had to fill out a form or check a box once. We haven't used the draft since 1973.
We haven't used the draft since 1973? Wow, I guess it's a non-issue then. I guess anything that happened before 1973 can no longer be brought up. You know, like, I don't know, women not having the right to vote. I guess we'll never hear that again because that was before 1973. And slavery, that's another one that happened before 1973. I guess we'll never talk about that again because, 1973 apparently is the cutoff point. Of course, he doesn't even consider the fact that there were men who were drafted in 1973 who are still alive today, suffering from the consequences of being drafted into a war they didn't want to go to. But apparently those men don't count, right? Because it hasn't been enacted since 1973. So it's no longer an argument, apparently. Now, that's a strange thing because knowing better as a veteran, and I would have thought he would have had compassion for those men who have been previously drafted. But, hey, 1973 is the cutoff year, apparently. Anything that happened before that, we can no longer discuss, even though men are still required to sign up to the draft. And there are consequences for not doing so, even though it's gender-specific and doesn't affect women. Here's an idea. Why don't we have a female-only draft? Because, it hasn't been enacted since 1973, and apparently it's not a big deal. So, hey, we'll just swap it over. We'll just make it so it's female-only, right? I'm sure no one will have an issue with that whatsoever. I'm sure everyone will be perfectly fine with that. And there won't be anyone screaming that it's sexist and unfair because it only affects one gender. And it has severe consequences if you don't tick that box. Now, of course, I'm not seriously suggesting that we have a female-only draft. I'm just trying to make a point. I have to specify that just in case some dishonest asshole like Knowing Better tries to quote mine me. But the point still stands. If you have a requirement which is male-only, it is by its very definition sexist. Considering feminism is meant to be equality for everyone, and feminism cares about men too, I would expect that you would be agreeing with us. I would expect that you'd be saying, you know what, the MRAs have a point, maybe we should get rid of the draft entirely, or include women in it, and just make it even. But no, you have to somehow diminish and dismiss it and then make it about women, right? Because women weren't allowed on the front lines. So therefore, that's the real issue.
We've been an all-volunteer force since then, meaning it hasn't affected anyone born after 1956.
It was just an honest mistake that I didn't know. I was in a homeless shelter, you know what I'm saying, just trying to find my way through life. Financial advisor called me and let me know that I know anything about selective service, and I was like, no sir. He was like, well, they red flagged your finances because you didn't sign up to go to the Army. My children looks up to me, and they're expecting me to succeed in life. And with all these doors came, I still had to persevere because I have these little ones watching me.
So it hasn't affected anyone who was born after 1956. Well, that's good to know. That's good to know. You know, that is if you exclude the 1 million men that have been affected by it. But I guess those million men don't count, right? I guess they're only men after all, right? Knowing better. So it's not a big deal. And in 2018, 112,051 names and addresses of suspected violators were sent to the Justice Department for possible prosecution. So, I mean, that's only over 100,000 men, right? That's nothing, because it hasn't affected anyone since 1973. So it's not a big deal, apparently. Because, those men don't count. The 112,000 men who had their names sent to the Department of Justice last year, they don't count. It's not important. It's almost like they don't exist. And the interesting thing is not signing up for the draft can affect you with things like citizenship and federal student loans and, things like that, which I would think a progressive would be in favour of those things, would be supportive of people getting student loans and student aid and citizenship and things like that. But apparently that's not important. It's not important, right? Because it's only affecting men. The more important issue is that women weren't allowed to go to the front lines. And apparently that's the only topic we can talk about, right? Because we have to derail the conversation every time we talk about the unfair treatment of men being the sole ones having to sign up for a draft. No, we can't talk about that. We can't talk about the million men getting unfair treatment under the system. No, we have to focus on the women. So I guess the response to the argument I just made is, well, it's only ticking a box. Why don't men just do it? Well, the simple fact is a lot of men don't know that they have to do it because it varies from state to state. So, sure, in some states, people do it without even realising they're doing it. But in other states, you can miss out on doing it without even intending to or without even knowing that you should. I'm pretty sure the 1 million men who didn't sign weren't doing so as a protest. But, I guess they don't count, right? Knowing better hasn't affected anyone.
Collecting Social Security, the draft isn't something you've ever had to worry about.
The draft isn't something you've ever had to worry about.
And the draft is so historically unpopular that it would take something like Red Dawn happening for us to ever use it again. And I have a feeling that if that were to happen, we'd suddenly be okay with the draft. But it still might. someday. Men feel that this is unfair since they have to sign up for the draft and women don't. But actually, that's about to change. One of the main arguments against women being part of the draft was that they weren't allowed in combat.
I have to say, I don't understand this argument. Surely there are many jobs in the military which is not frontline infantry. Surely there are many support jobs, many very, very important support jobs which could be done by women. And in fact have been done by women ever since women have been allowed into the military. So if you're going to have a draft for men, I don't know why you wouldn't also have a draft for women, even if women aren't on the front lines in the infantry. That argument doesn't make any sense to me. Now, maybe there's a reason I haven't thought of because, I've never been in the military. I'm more than happy to listen to an explanation down in the comments section, but it just doesn't hold water as far as I'm concerned at the moment.
Since that changed in 2016, Congress set up a commission to reevaluate the selective service system, whether that means including women or abolishing it entirely.
It will be interesting if they abolish it entirely because, we can't subject women to the draft. That thing which really hasn't affected any men since 1973 and really isn't a big deal at all. It would be funny if suddenly it is a big deal and we just get rid of it.
There was also a recent court case that ruled an all-male draft was unconstitutional on the basis of that 2016 combat role change. But when men's rights groups bring up issues that are important to them and present their information, they don't bring up any serious solutions. Instead, they just conclude that therefore, feminism is wrong. Since Congress already set up a commission, that decision didn't really carry much weight.
And here we see Knowing Better dismissing the actions taken by the National Coalition for Men because, they're MRAs actively fighting for the rights of men and we can't have that, can we, Knowing Better? You just have to do everything you can to dismiss not only men's issues but those men who are fighting for them because we're not part of your ideology. Right? That's really the agenda here. This is just propaganda, let's face it. You're not really interested in having a conversation or fixing these issues. This is pure propaganda. Now, speaking of Knowing Better and propaganda, I said at the start of this video that Knowing Better claimed that the Red Pill was made by MRAs, and in fact it was made by a feminist, and not MRAs at all. Well, since I recorded that bit of audio, I came across a tweet by Knowing Better where he defends the argument that the Red Pill was made by MRAs. And he highlights that Mike Cernovich was the associate producer. Well done, Knowing Better. You got us. You got us with that one. I don't know how to counter that argument, that a non-MRA like Mike Cernovich was the executive producer of the Red Pill, therefore it was made by MRAs. What a fantastic argument. A non-MRA was the executive producer, therefore it was made by MRAs. Pure genius by Knowing Better here. This is the perfect example of the level of detail and research that Knowing Better puts into something. It's incredibly impressive. I think we're all floored by his sheer amount of research. Of course, Knowing Better is such an idiot that he doesn't know the difference between actual MRAs and non-MRAs, so we shouldn't be surprised. Furthermore, Mike Cernovich did not have any creative say in the Red Pill. All he did was donate a fair amount of money after the footage was shot. This was the point in the production where Cassie J originally had backers who were feminist and progressive, but once they realised it wasn't going to be a hit piece against MRAs, they all pulled out. Although, from memory, some of them offered to put in money if they had final cut. And Cassie J, to her credit, said no. So she opened it up to crowdfunding, and in doing so, a lot of people donated money, and one of them was Mike Cernovich. Now, I'm not a huge fan of Mike Cernovich. And in the past I've speculated that maybe the only reason he donated money was to promote his name and attach himself to this. I don't know. But either way, he had no creative say over it, and he's not an MRA. So, yeah, you didn't get us with that one, knowing better. That's another fail. We'll put in the fail column. Not too many wins so far, knowing better. Not too many at all. Well, that's it for this episode, folks. Next episode, we will be covering education, sentencing, and healthcare. And the one after that is suicide, homelessness, and domestic violence. And we still have a huge amount to get through from knowing better. His video is quite dense with claims, as you may have noticed. So there will be episodes for some time in the future.
A year-long study by the Marine Corps indicates that groups or units that are all male perform better than mixed units that include females. Now, according to the study, all male units were faster, more lethal, and able to evacuate casualties in less time. Also, all male squads performed better than mixed groups in 69% of the tasks evaluated.
Unfortunate number.
All right, so that is kind of an interesting number. Also, all male squads, the study found, performed better than mixed gender units across the board. The males were more accurate hitting targets, faster at climbing over obstacles, and better at avoiding injuries.
Who did the study?
The Marine Corps. So
I believe it.
Yeah, I'm really happy that Wes is on the panel to talk about this, because remember, it was only 2 years ago that the government decided, all right, well, as long as women pass certain tests, then they can also fight on the front lines. And I agreed with that decision as long as they pass the tests. But if tests indicate that they're not physically able to do the same things that their male counterparts can do, then they shouldn't be fighting on the front lines.
So, well, okay, now this is an interesting question, because I believe that all those women are passing the minimum requirements. But the reality might be, and we don't know, remember, there's still a lot of knuckleheads in the Marines, right? So it's not like, okay, we've got the data scientists in here and et cetera.
It's 1 year-long study, so just keep that in mind. It's not
No, I hear you, but the Marines in the past, in 1992, decided that women were clear detriment to all fighting forces, et cetera, right? So there's the Marines, and they did a long study. I mean, that study was not accurate.
I think you're misunderstanding.
It's a pretty extensive study, dude. You should look at the study first.
Okay. So, no. Look, I'm not dismissing it. I'm about to agree with it, okay? But I'm saying take it with some degree of salt. It wasn't an independent group. It was the Marines did fight this for their entire existence, right?
You could argue that they were incentivized to come up with these results. But I tend to, I'm much more likely to agree with Wes.
Right, and don't get me wrong. They could have also been incentivized to come up with the results to the counter to this, because now the administration wants it, so
that's
there'll be
what I think
political pressure.
To is make it work, General, and that General's like, yes, sir.
That's right. So all those things I'm putting out there so you have context, right? Now, back to my point, which is that just because you pass a minimum doesn't mean that you're going to perform on average as well as males in the Marines, right? So if you have women in a certain unit, could they do the minimum? Yes. Could they be slower and not do the rest of the tests on average as well as just a male unit? It's possible, right? So, and that's what this study is indicating, given all the context of the study.
So let me give you guys some more details about what they found through this year-long study. They found that all male squads, teams, and crews, and gender-integrated squads, teams, and crews had a noticeable difference in their performance of the basic combat tasks of negotiating obstacles and evacuating casualties. For example, when negotiating the wall obstacle, male Marines threw their packs to the top of the wall, whereas female Marines required regular assistance in getting their packs to the top. So my question is, during the testing to indicate whether or not these women would be eligible to fight in the front lines, why is it that that wasn't part of the testing requirement, right? Like, if you can't throw your bag on top of a wall, then maybe you shouldn't be on the front lines, or maybe you shouldn't be in this unit.
So here's in Wes. So let's kick it over to you because you served, right? And here's what I don't get. So the Israelis have women in their military; they do perfectly fine, and many other countries do. So, but yet at the same time, there's some logic to this, right? Males, on average, perform about 25% better in physical feats. These are really loose numbers, but this is not. It's a known fact. It's not like men and women are physiologically exactly the same. Of course not, right? So all male division is probably going to do better on average than one that's mixed on physical activities. So what's the explanation for that dichotomy?
And I will say, okay, the women who there are individual women who can exceed the standard by far and could be. The fact that 2 women made it through Ranger School.
Mm-hmm.
That's fucking hard. It's a lot harder than these Marine training camps that these people were in.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, my own experience when I was in was I was only in a mixed unit as a cadet because I was in the cavalry, so I was in all-male units once I was in the service. But as a cadet, you go to something called advanced camp between your junior and senior year when they grade you. And this is everybody in ROTC, like in the country. And you're in mixed units and platoons, and it's probably like 15 to 20% female in the platoons. And this is the officer corps. These are going to be the most dedicated, physically fit, capable, able women. And when we did forced marches, none of them finished the march with their equipment. All their equipment they started with. A guy was carrying someone's backpack, and someone else carrying their weapon and their helmet. And I never saw, on the mental task, they're just as good as any male soldier. But on the physical task, most things involving war involve upper body strength. And women don't have it. As a general rule. So there are individuals who definitely do, but they found in this study that the top 10% of women physically are on par with the bottom 40% of men physically. So part of it also, when I think about the military, is that if you're going to be drafted, I'm sure everybody wants to be in combat when there's not a big war, but if we ever have to go back to a draft, how are they going to differentiate between men and women and who has to go to what kinds of units?
So let me ask you this. Is it possible, because it strikes me there's 2 possibilities, and maybe there are more, but is there some psychological reason for this too? Like, is it that what you, and it was part of your answer there, that's what raised my curiosity, that women weren't finishing without men carrying something of them, right? So is there some psychological component that we still have left over, because we're fairly recent to this integration, that the men in a unit feel compelled to help the women in a unit?
No, they wouldn't have been able to finish it.
So then it sounds like, though, then it could largely be solved by increasing the standards. Pretty much, then you'd just have...
Then you just wouldn't have women.
Or you'd have money...
1 or 2.
You'd have,
but then you might not have,
women.
But you might not have enough Marines.
That's the big thing. That's why they're pushing for more women, because they found that they're not getting high enough quality male applicants. And so for the last 15 years, they've been pushing for more and more women in the service because so many guys now are just physically unfit. I'm sure you guys covered the article about obesity and how something like 80% of American teenagers aren't fit for military service. So they don't have a lot of choices as to who to go with.
So what would you do then? Would you allow women in combat positions like this or no?
I don't know.
Are you sure that this test is a good reflection of what's necessary in combat? You trust that they did that right?
Yeah, I trust they did it right. Absolutely. And I trust, if anything, my guess is they were gaming it towards further integration of the services, because your number one priority as a commander or a high-level officer in the military is your retention rates and how many people are re-enlisting. So you want as many women in as you can who want to be there. Mm-hmm. I would put people in some units, but you got to increase the standards. And then if you get to a real war, heaven forbid we ever have an actual real war where there's a draft and people don't want to go to war and you got to find people, then how does it work? So will women be forced into combat units that don't want to go?
So would you increase the standards?
Leave the standards as they are.
And this is what happens, is that the performance is slightly less on this activity. Might be better at some other stuff. The mental acuity of the unit, of a mixed unit, I bet is better.
The number one thing I've learned from working with women in the military is that they generally don't freak out as much as the men do.
What? Really?
Really?
There's not an emotional kind of, fuck you! I mean, that comes out of guys in a high-stress situation. They're more like, hey, let's get the problem kind of solved.
Right, because they're engaging in a process where they know there's going to be intense emotional situation anyway.
But also,
so
understand,
they're more prepared for it.
where are the guys coming from who go into the service, and where are the women coming from? I mean, most of the guys, at least the ones I served with, played contact sports for several years before they went in. Did the women play contact sports?
No.
Did they have to wear a bunch of equipment, carry a bunch of heavy shit around and hit people? No. Well, then they're not going to come in as prepared as the guys are.
That's
for a lot of
interesting.
this.
So let me run two ironic ideas by you. One is that we allow women into the Ranger program and the SEALs and all that stuff, but not into the Marines. Because if you can make it to the Ranger program, you've proven yourself, right? Whereas with the Marines, the standards are lower, so then then that might be an issue. Is that crazy talk?
Well, hey, just because these women went to Ranger school, that doesn't mean they're going to be in a Ranger battalion leading it. My guess is they're not. There's still no women in the infantry for the Army. So just because they went to Ranger school, they're still going to wind up being in Signal Corps or PSYOPs or something else when they're done with it.
So the second idea I had was, look, right now we're not going to World War II, right? We don't need as many bodies, right? So I would rather have equality, and I would rather have those women who are smart and are doing well on the tests rise up through the military and provide that advantage to the military, right? Because we don't need them in the front line so much, but I don't want to disqualify them, right? Now, on the other hand, if we have a draft and we're going to a giant war, does that change the equation?
Yeah, I think it changes the equation. You'll find a lot of people, if there's a giant war, and because America hasn't really been in a giant war for a very long time, and even World War II, we only lost 250,000 people. By the way, that's how many people have already died in Syria, just in the last year. Is what we did in 4 years of World War II. We lost 250,000. That's not a lot of people. So we haven't really been in a mass casualty war like that.
About 53,000 in Vietnam.
50, and only under 10
Yeah.
in our latest. Although, in all fairness, without modern medical procedures and everything else, the death toll would have been 50 or 60,000 for this 10-year debacle.
So I think I would summarize by saying this. Generally, TYT is in favor of science, right, and rational decision making. So, if people say, oh, women, I can't be in the military, oh, they can't do anything. No. And by the way, a lot of people do say that. It's not like, I'm making that up.
They
right?
just make a noise and kind of...
like that, right? So we're against that. But if it turns out that you do legitimate studies with, that West thinks, a lot of us think, overall, given the full context, is a legitimate study, and they, on average, don't do as well then we should have a conversation about what roles women should have in the military.
Let me give you my perspective on it from a guy who was on my tank crew who went to VMI. Do you remember VMI? When we were kids, there was the big, there's a woman coming in and stuff.
Right, the Citadel.
And I asked him, I'm like, well, how do you feel about it? He goes, dude, I went there and, man, I don't even know why guys would want to go there. I mean, look, being in a combat unit it's great when you're not in combat.
Yeah, so be careful what you wish for. You just might get it.